in heat waves, but the opportunity arrived when this happened at this site. And so we were measuring canopy scale fluxes using a above canopy eddy covariance approach with P2RMS. So it gives us a flux from the whole canopy. And during this study then, we started out in the early part of the growing season, there was no drought. So it was a normal year, normal precipitation up to that point. Then we went into a mild drought in summer, June and July. And so we're seeing moving from left to right here, we're seeing the average diurnal profile for each of these 6 periods. And you see there the lines, the green is isoprene and the red is monoterpenes, which are the 2 dominant BVOC. And so you can see from these diurnal profiles that as we go from that no drought to mild drought, there's a large increase in both isoprene and monoterpenes. And then as we go from the mild drought to the severe drought, there's a decrease. So we also made leaf level measurements. So we had leaf cuvette systems. We could go out there, measure photosynthesis, transpiration, and control the temperature. So we could make measurements, get temperature response curves, but also make measurements at the same temperature in different plants. We looked at 4 dominant tree species in the tower footprint. And so you can see here, they have the black dots. That's during the no drought to a moderate drought period. And then the red is the severe drought. And so you can see 3 of these species here. There's, with the severe drought, there's a decrease, a substantial decrease at the same temperature. And also you can see that the temperature sensitivity, which is typically very large for these BVOC, goes away in severe drought. So the trees don't continue to increase more isoprene as the temperature goes up. So this is the case with 3 of the species. But in the case of the 4th, the Quercus stellata, the post oak, we don't see this. It actually, with severe drought, the emissions increase. So the post oak is a drought tolerant, more drought tolerant species. And this is likely what's happening here is that for the post oak, this is not such a severe drought. It's still doing okay. So this follows this idea that as we go to moderate drought, there's a decrease in these emissions, but with severe drought, if it's a severe drought for that plant species, then there's a decrease. And we can look further at these controlling processes with laboratory growth chambers experiments. And so we are doing these now in my lab at UC Irvine. And so we can do experiments where we hold temperature constant and vary the water. We can hold the water constant and vary the temperature. And in this way, we can look and see that at least in these potted plants and in the growth chamber, that both drought and temperature are important. And we're starting now to look at synergistic effects and looking at the role of, looking at gene expression. So we can try to understand the role of what's a biological response and what's a physical response. So these are all fairly small scale looks at this. And so another thing we can do is look and see if this is happening on large scales. And so, for example, my colleague Yuxuan Wang led this effort in looking at isoprene concentrations, which are measured at a lot of air quality monitoring stations. So we have across the US and other countries, these air quality monitoring stations that are looking at VOC. They're targeting anthropogenic VOC, but they also measure isoprene, the dominant BVOC. So we can use these data, long-term measurements that cover drought periods and non-drought periods. And so here looking at the SPEI, one of the drought indexes, and we can see that when you have a mild drought, so an SPEI -1 to -2, we see more isoprene in the air. So accounting for other things, there's more isoprene in the air when there's a mild drought. We can't really see what's going on with getting into severe drought. Maybe a drop there, but really I think we don't have sufficient data to judge that. So we've taken these data sets, we've developed a model. We have a model called MEGAN that we use to model emissions around the world. So it's widely used in air quality models and climate models to get these biogenic VOC and look at their impact on ozone and particles. And in the past, our focus for this model is just to get plants in optimal conditions and get general global distributions. But now we'd really like to know, well, what happens in these conditions of drought and heat stresses? And so looking at this, and here looking at that data set from that Missouri, the above canopy data set from that Missouri case, really just our one case. We run this in the community land model. So land model that accounts for photosynthesis and soil moisture and drought, so driving the carbon and water part. And so we use this to drive our emission algorithms. And when we add the drought response to this, we get a pretty good R squared. So we're getting about 2/3 of the variance. And this is actually about the same as what you get for photosynthesis. If you run CLM, look at how well it does for photosynthesis and transpiration, it's about the same. So we're doing okay here, but obviously we're not getting everything. And also this is just looking at one site. And so we want to expand this to other ecosystems and get more replications here. And one way we can do that is we're working on engaging the global carbon and water flux community to add these BVOC fluxes to FluxNet sites. Now, the technique that we have been using, PTRMS, is really expensive. And it requires a lot of power. So it's just not suitable for putting it at a lot of sites, but we're working on a low cost, low power system that we think we could deploy at many sites and get a lot more of this data.
Alex, 2 minutes.
Okay, but also a complementary approach, really 2 minutes, is going to a site where we have these naturally dry and hot conditions. And there's a place like that. And so that's Yatir Forest. And so we've gone there, has everything we need in terms of the infrastructure and great colleagues to work with. And it gets even better. So they have this amazing mobile laboratory that's enabled us to measure BVOC fluxes from the same tree species in a mesic site and a dryland site. And so here's the results. So we measured these whole canopy terpene fluxes in April and May as things were starting to dry out in Israel. And our model without the drought algorithm could predict the observations at the mesic site, Berea, but not at Yatir, the dryland site. And the addition of the drought algorithm improved this. So we also have measurements with enclosure measurements. And these indicate for one of the species, Quercus calaprinos, it's about what we expect for without the drought algorithm, indicating perhaps this was not too droughted. But with the others, it gets the trend right, but the model can't get the magnitude. The trend that we observe, the change that we observe is greater than what we'd expect from the model. So it indicates we still have some work here. And so we're getting to the point where we can start thinking about the general picture here. Terpenes are thought to increase cloud condensation nuclei and so lead to more precipitation. And so if extreme drought increases terpene emissions, then we might expect a negative feedback. We get more rain. And extreme drought, however, would decrease emissions. And so we would get a positive feedback, less rain. So this means a hotter and drier world could be pushing some ecosystems from a stable negative feedback to a unstable positive feedback. Now we can simulate these processes in the models, but we really need to understand a lot of all of these components. And we clearly have a lot of work before we can really assess this hypothesis with any confidence. To do this, we need more field measurements, and I hope we can get out in the field again and in sites like Yatir Forest and make more measurements and make some more progress here. And I want to conclude with a big shout out thanks to Dan for his vision and scientific insights, and especially the generosity and hospitality of Dan and the entire group there at Weissman. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Alex. That was beautiful. We have maybe time for one quick question. If not, or Lena, do you want to ask? Just unmute yourself. Please.
That was a good idea. Yeah, to unmute myself. Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm interested in the white oak. So any correlations between the minimum temperature increase, the trend that we're seeing in the sites, and the response you're seeing with the drought? Because currently we're seeing more of increase in the trend of the drought, of the minimum temperature, as much as we're seeing it in the maximum temperature. So is there any correlation between these two and the response to the drought?
Yeah, so looking at the temperature of the soil in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that. So that'd
Okay.
be interesting to do, okay. And you think in particular the minimum temperature?
Yeah, I would
Okay.
honestly, yeah. I'm just curious because of my other thing that I'm working on. So just to see if we're comparing that between the sites.
Yeah, we haven't looked at that.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And we are staying in California, but we're moving on to Professor Naomi Teague at UCSB to a more recent collaboration. So stage is yours, Naomi.
Cool. Oh, did I just stop sharing? Give me 1 sec, almost there. Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me to this this session. I only wish that we were actually all together in Israel so we could properly toast Dan at the end of this session, but this will have to do. I'm going to start by thanking, of course, everything I present isn't really work that I do by myself, but involves a whole group of people, including people in my lab here at California, but also an ongoing collaboration with Tamir Klein's lab there at the Weissman. So mostly I'm just grateful for all of their support. So we all know that forests are changing. I can give you a couple of examples from California here where I live. Between 2010 and 2015, we lost 40 million trees to drought. Perhaps even more dramatic is this year. It was the biggest fire year we've ever had in California. And we burned basically an area that would cover the entire state of Israel, right? So forests are changing. And of course, we expect these things to get worse, particularly, you know, and Dan has alluded to this, in these Mediterranean type ecosystems where we are already seeing increases in temperature. This shows just temperature from one of the sites that I work at in California. And we see changing precipitation patterns. And of course, there are forest management actions that influence these things as well. And so all of these changes really inspire land managers and the public. Everyone's like, oh, we have to do something. And well, what can we do? And the things that we typically propose are things like density reduction, whether that's to try to reduce forest mortality or try field treatments to reduce the severity of fire, or we go in and we do restoration and try to change the species to in some way mitigate some of these effects. But really, as scientists, this leads to a lot of questions about what are the consequences of these management actions for things like forest growth and mortality risk and fire and water. And today I just want to give you a little bit of an insight into what I think is as a good strategy for trying to answer those questions. I'm going to focus mostly on carbon and water, but the work I'm doing also involves fire. So where do we start when we want to answer those types of questions? And I would argue we start with theory. And the theory comes really from the synthesis of the literature. And the literature really often means putting together a bunch of different empirical studies, which give us insight into the processes that are involved. So for example, my colleagues and I recently did a synthesis of literature asking the question, what are the eco-hydrologic impacts simply of density reduction, particularly in these Mediterranean type ecosystems like California and Israel? And interestingly, what we find is that there's fairly strong evidence when you take trees out, you increase the growth and water use of the remaining trees. But importantly, there's huge variation in the magnitude of that effect. Evidence that you actually increase groundwater recharge or surface water stream flow is much less. And in fact, some studies show declines in those things. And we also have some notion of what the mechanisms are that lead to this heterogeneity of response. And that has to do with all kinds of compensating mechanisms, right? You take out a tree, well, you open up the understory, right? You may get more transpiration and evaporation from the understory. You may get changes to litter and soil evaporation. In places that have snow, you can change the timing and amount of snow, which obviously has implications for the timing of water availability. Right? Things get even more complicated when we start to look at, well, you know, a thinning event and a management event doesn't happen all the time. Forests are dynamic, they will change. If you thin a forest, it will recover over time. There are very few studies that actually track that over the long term, right? Thinning or forest management in itself often leads to species change, which can change forest water use. Some studies have actually shown that because of the change in species triggered by a thinning event, you actually get reductions in stream flow. And of course, all of this can change fire regimes and other disturbance regimes, which they themselves feed back on carbon and water. So I think what all this points to is both the value of theory that comes from field experiments, right? But the problem with it, right? Because we just can't do enough of them. The problem is if I go out and do a nice field experiment where I do a density reduction, well, what if I get a drought the next year? Or what if I get a big wet year the next year? We can't keep repeating the thinning experiment in the same place. What if I do it on a north versus south facing slope? What if I change the pre-existing forest structure? How do all of these things interact to really influence the effect of these forest management actions on the things we care about, water, carbon, fire? So, of course, one way to deal with that is to link some of this theory-based understanding into process-based models. And that, of course, is what I do, and I'm one of the principal developers of RESIS, which is this type of model. But I emphasize that for these models to answer these questions, we have to represent some of these processes. So hydrologically, we can't have a big leaf model, right? We have to account for overstory and understory, right? We have to have a representation of soil evaporation because we think these things, these compensation, for example, of thinning on increasing understory evaporation is one of the important compensating mechanisms. Our field experiments tell us that. So we have to model, you know, we have to have a certain level of realism in our water cycle representation. If we want to look at multi-year effects, we have to link this with growth. We typically do that by having fully coupled water and carbon cycling models, right? Where we're modeling photosynthesis and respiration, but also how we allocate that to forest growth over time. And we have to have some sort of representation of mortality. And we have to have these so that we can account for spatial heterogeneity in conditions, radiation on north versus south facing slopes, but also the lateral redistribution of water. So we can account for the fact that places down slope may be getting additional water from lateral inputs. And we have to really run these at hourly to daily time step models because as those of you who work in Mediterranean environments, you know, it isn't the annual amount of precipitation that often matters. It's the timing and magnitude of those storm events that can really make a difference in terms of these processes. The other thing I'll say that we've been really working towards in this type of modeling is really a two-scale modeling approach, so that we can capture some of the within stand processes that we think are important. For example, shading between tree species or parts or tree clumps of different heights. Accounting for sharing within the rooting zone between different trees that might have different rooting depths. But of course, we can do this with tree scales or stand scale models. But the problem with those is it's hard to distribute them over space and run it over a full hill slope or a full watershed or ultimately a larger region. So we're really trying to work towards this kind of semi-mechanistic realism at two different scales, where we account for some of the within stand heterogeneity, but still can account for heterogeneity along hill slopes. Now, of course, these types of models are little data hungry pigs, right? They just want to eat data. And they do that for two reasons. One, it's nice to have a theoretical model, but we want to have some notion of how good this model is. Does it work? So we do things like compare the model with stream flow, or we compare it with flux tower evapotranspiration, or we compare our model estimates of growth with tree ring widths, or a variety of metrics that we can get from remote sensing. But we're also using data here to calibrate the model, to reduce the incredible uncertainty in all of the many parameters that are involved in modeling all of these different processes. Now, of course, once we've done that, we can do cool things, right? We can take the model and we can say, when we do forest management and we have climate change, how does it affect carbon? How does it affect fire regimes? How does it affect water? And I just give you some examples of papers where we've done that, including a paper where we did this at the very famous Yatir forest that we've all been talking about. But I want to give you an example today of some recent work we've been doing, where we've been doing this kind of link between these process-based model and intensively monitored field experiments to be able to do some interesting things with reducing parameter uncertainty. So this is some work I've been doing with Tamir Klein's lab at the Yishi forest in Israel, which is a little bit different from the Yatir forest in that it's a mixed forest. It has a range of different species, some Aleppo pines like you see at Yatir, but also some pistachios, some cypresses. And what this allows us to do is start to ask questions about species composition, right? And in this first study, really looking at, well, how does a mixed forest, how does it cycle water and carbon differently from the homogeneous forests that we often use in our other studies? And so what's great about this site is Tamir and his group have made lots and lots of great measurements, including, for example, sap flow measurements through the growing season of these different species, along with the kind of structural measurements that you'd want, right? The height of the species, something about the rooting depth of the species. So what we can do in a place like this is take this data and come up with species-specific parameterizations of the model. And
no mean 2 minutes.
Right. So why do really already? Wow. Why do we need that? We need that because some of these species, because there's a lot of uncertainty on those species. So what we do is we take these measurements and we use it to come up with species-specific parameterizations. We can then do interesting model studies where we compare homogeneous stands with mixed stands, where these different species are sharing, are influencing each other in terms of sharing of water in the root zone and shading each other. And we can run that over long periods of time climatologically, looking at wet years and dry years. And we end up with graphs like this. This is total biomass of our different species. The box plots show that we still have a lot of parameter uncertainty and climate variability makes a difference. But the solid box plots on the left show the results when we have our fully mixed stands. The results on the right show our carbon total biomass when we run these as homogeneous stands. And what we see is some trees, like this Aleppo pine, do much better in the mixed forest because they're competing less in a certain way. Other species, like our pistachio, do a little bit worse, but not so much that when you average across all of the species, what we see is a significant gain in total biomass, right? You've allowed for this niche partitioning, and with our model, we're able to quantify that effect. And we see about a 40% increase in overall total biomass, thinking of this as a mixed forest rather than a bunch of homogeneous independent stands, but only a 20% increase in transpiration, so more water use efficient. So I think what I've tried to show you here is the way in which there's this really nice coupling between process-based models and field data. Field data led to the development of the mechanisms that we have in those models, but really intensive sites like the Yishi or Yatir forest allow us to come up with interesting parameterization, all of which gives us the tools we need to answer these big questions, like if we're going to go out and change species or thin forests, will it make a difference? And I really think that's a fundamental question, and it's collaborations like this, right, which, to go back to Dan, his setting up of intensively monitored sites like the Yatir forest allow us to do. It allows us to really move forward in what I would think of as ecoinformatics, where we link these different data sets with these types of models. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, for this beautiful presentation. Again, we're short in time, so if you have a question, one short question. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, I have a question. I also had a question for Alex, but I put it in the chat, but he's not looking there. So look in the chat. And for Naomi, yeah, it was very interesting. And I wonder, your model is getting more and more detailed. I wonder if VOCs are getting into the model and have any kind of an effect. Certainly, it's part of the carbon budget, but maybe has some other effects.
Yeah, maybe I should, sit down and have a beer with Alex after this session, because the answer to your question is no. I'm blatantly ignoring VOCs, but point well taken, Dan.
Okay, so we started with the atmosphere. We moved on to the soil water and the hydrology, and now we're gonna concentrate on the trees with Professor Steven Levitz from Arizona, who will take us to tree rings. Please, Steven.
Thank you, Tamir. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Good morning to everybody over in the New World here, and good afternoon, good evening to the folks over in Europe, Middle East. I want to tell a few stories. They're short stories, they're not novels, about some studies involving tree rings and isotopes. That image in the lower left-hand corner is related to a project that Dan was running in conjunction with Debbie Hemming from the UK Met Office now, in terms of looking at tree rings at Yatir, as well as a couple of other sites. And I'll show just a little bit of data of that in a couple of minutes. And I think Alex made a good point that sometimes, or frankly, usually, a single isotope measurement is not going to reveal that much in helping us understand a process or a system. We need to have multiple gas exchange measurements of a plant or a biosystem to understand its performance in time. It could be daily measurements, it could be seasonal, could be multi-year measurements that you can compare from one year to the next. There's other ways to track plant isotopes through time besides gas exchange measurements. And Dan actually used one of them. This is a paper, and it really intriguing paper that he was involved in, where he analyzed the pages of journals journals from North America and journals from Europe and took micro samples of them and analyzed their carbon isotope composition, and was able to determine that the paper used for those journals was more or less tracking the change in atmospheric delta C13 or C13-C12 ratio of atmospheric CO2. So that would be one way. You know, if we have books at all these sites and the books are accumulating day after day, year after year, we can tear the pages off those books and make some measurements relative to the experiments. There's another way though, and that involves using tree rings to track isotope changes through time. This can be done on several time scales, including within the ring, so that you can learn something about seasonal changes in processes through those isotopes. You can look at the other end of the telescope and you can look at very long records. So there's millennial scale tree ring records in which isotopes can be analyzed or have been analyzed, so we can have a long view in terms of changes. This is Dan at one of the sites that we collected in that project. And I think the best way to explain this, you know, by now probably everybody in this meeting sort of knows about tree rings and isotopes and what the isotopes might tell us in those tree rings. But I tend to think of it in a simple-minded fashion, that environment interacts with the physiology and physicochemical processes within the tree, particularly within the leaf, to imprint isotope signals that end up in the tree rings. This simple-minded model I have put together here, and let's see if I can bring up a laser pointer here. So here's our measurements. So we get a core such as Dan had taken, or we have a slab of wood here. We can separate out rings. We can analyze their 18O-16O ratio, 13C-12C ratio, deuterium-hydrogen ratio, and have a series of these isotopes through time. And what might they be telling us? In a way, it's complex. In other ways, it's sort of simple. It can be telling us a lot of stuff, but frequently where one thing dominates in terms of imprinting that signal, that factor, that parameter that dominates allows us to do interesting things with it, especially with respect to paleoclimate, for example. So in this diagram, atmospheric parameters, temperature, precipitation, moisture, humidity, sunlight can all make their way into these signals by going through these mechanisms, these physiological, physicochemical mechanisms, such as fractionation, the biochemistry, diffusion, et cetera. And we end up with a record here. Other things can also imprint. So the composition of gases in the atmosphere, particularly the isotope composition of CO2 that was done with the pages of those journals that Dan had published, could be pollution effects in the atmosphere affecting these mechanisms and what gets into these signals. Pollution could also affect soil chemistry, and there could be some input from pollution through the roots into the tree that could also affect this apparatus. There could be other ecological types of things relating to shading, competition, fire, herbivory, et cetera, that could make their way through this mechanism and be recorded in terms of some kind of variation or change in variation in isotopes. Additionally, it's possible to get spatial representation of isotopes. So not just time as a key thing about using tree rings and measurements of isotopes in tree rings to tell us something, but we actually might be able to use trees in some kind of spatial mode to tell us about changes over an area and changes through time over an area. Here's one of the stories that I briefly wanted to tell you about. This is a study from Russ Monson. Russ Monson actually had a very large macro system grant here at the University of Arizona. Paul Shaner and Ed Wright did a tremendous amount of work on the project, and Paul Shaner got his PhD working on the project. And it involved a couple of transects, ponderosa pine trees in the Western United States, particularly the Southwestern United States. And there's different climate as you go from the southern reach of these transects up to the northern. So in the southern reach, this is the precipitation. We see there's a big summer input of precipitation down here. In the north, though, precipitation is low. And then when you get in between them, you have something that's intermediate. So difference in terms of not necessarily the amount of precipitation, but in terms of distribution of precipitation over the growing season. And another thing that was done was with respect to the scale of measurements. And so the measurements were done on a seasonal basis over a number of years. And it's sort of represented here. This is the beginning of one tree ring is here. The end is over here. And what they did was they divided the ring, each ring, and about 50 years worth of rings at each of these sites into 3 parts. One part was the late wood, and late wood is often referred to as summer wood. And so that's formed late in the growing season. So that's kind of a late summer kind of production. The early wood is formed at the beginning of the growing season. They threw out the material. I think they still have it. But they're not using it for isotope analysis. But they did analyze this for carbon isotopes and oxygen, and likewise the late wood at all these sites. And in terms of a little bit about what they found, this is delta 18O, and this is the early wood. So this is this part versus April, May, June vapor pressure deficit. This one is late wood versus April, May, June vapor pressure deficit, and this is late wood versus vapor pressure deficit, July, August, September. So we do see for the early wood a strong response over most of the sites to VPD in April, May, June for that early wood. For late wood, though, there's pretty much no relationship between the delta 018 and late wood and VPD in April, May, June. But during the summer, we see some. We see some which is primarily down here in the southern reaches of the transects. We're not seeing it up here. C13 provides more information. C13 was also analyzed in all these trees. And so for that early wood, we're seeing most of the sites a strong relationship of the carbon isotopes with vapor pressure deficit. For the late wood with summer VPD, likewise, most of the sites have a strong relationship with VPD. And late wood actually turns out has a strong relationship with April, May, June VPD as well. So these kinds of measurements and comparisons are informing or guiding that project in terms of influences on growth, environment throughout the growing season, physiological processes in terms of uptake, storage and use of carbohydrates to make wood and so forth. So they've actually done a lot in this study. Here's a couple of the papers that have come out of it so far. I think Paul Shaner's also published at least one paper as well as a first author. This is a project that I've been involved in. It started sort of in the early to mid 1980s, and it involves sampling a number of sites for pinyon pine around the western states or southwestern states. A couple of species actually represented here, Pinus monophylla and Pinus edulis, are represented in these different sites. Only one species per site. As you go to the west, it's dominated by monophylla. Over in the east, it's dominated by edulis. So that was initially done in the mid 80s, and it was done, the tree rings were separated in 5-year ring groups. They were resampled toward the end of the last century, between 1999 and 2003. And individual years were analyzed from 85 to 89. In fact, one of the people that helped collect or do this recollection is actually on this meeting. It's Lena Ababna. And I believe that she collected these 2 sites here, maybe this one, I'm not sure, but I believe that she recollected these 2 sites. Debbie Hemming actually helped to recollect these as well. So it's more difficult to get out. And maybe it's time to do another one. It's now 20 years later. It's maybe time, you'll see what the data shows from the intervals available, but maybe it's time to look again. This is an example of different sites, sort of what they look like, semi-arid sites. This is the record from the 80s in terms of the delta C13 through time. These light vertical bars represent years or pentads, frankly, 5-year ring groups, where there's similarity in terms of a signal. Like this pattern here, this triplet of high delta C13 values. We can see that in other sites as well. And so there's something going on in terms of influencing carbon isotopes in these tree rings over a large area. And it's related to climate. And in fact, what we did was we took these records and considered that average climate would be like the best fit line through here. And then these high points and low points would be deviations above and below sort of the normal climate. And then we could devise a drought index. So these values would be higher than what the smooth trend would be through here. And that's higher 13 to 12 ratios. And that's what you can expect under water stress. When plants—
2 minutes, dude.
2 minutes?
Yeah.
2 minutes, okay. So we came up with an isotope drought measure using that. These are isoscapes from that network of sites for 1900 to 04, 1915 to 19. This is Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is a common indicator of drought used particularly in North America. Very strong drought indicated in that time period with the tree rings, isotopes, as well as with PDSI. Very wet indicated by both. This was during the time when the allotment of the Colorado River was determined based on the flow. So this was part of a very wet period, which eventually determined when or who was going to get water and how much water was going to be available. These are other isoscapes for 98, 99. These were big El Nino years, like El Nino of the century, La Nina of the century, and that, of course, was the 20th century. So we see it wet here in 97, 98, dry here. We're teleconnected to El Nino in the Southwest. So during El Nino events, we're wetter than average. And that's what we see in terms of the isotopes here. During La Nina, the teleconnection is the reverse. So this would be dry if we had a map of La Nina teleconnections. We see dryness here. Another thing we can do, Tamir? Oh.
Go ahead, this wasn't me.
Okay, another thing was a water use efficiency. So this is a calculation of water use efficiency with those isotopes. That's through time. This is based on CO2 concentration. This is funny. So this is 2000 CO2 concentration. That's in our rear view mirrors quite a way back now, because now we're well over 410 parts per million. This is from the project of Dan's. So Yatir was the driest site. It has the highest water use efficiency. It's probably toward the upper end of these pinyons. Carmel is down here. It's the wetter of the sites, and it's probably plotting somewhere down here with respect to that. The last thing I want to say quickly was about China. There's a semi-arid monsoon climate here. There's a project led by Liu Yu from Xi'an Institute of Less and Quaternary Geology. This is a map of Xi'an and where the site is located. Really quickly, he found very strong correlation of delta 018 with instrumental temperature records. And so this was using the delta O18 to reconstruct temperature, and it matches the instrumental records tremendously. And then you could take it back through time and get a record through the 20th century through the delta O18. The instrumental records in China frequently don't go back that far. So even going back to the beginning of the century is actually good. And the title of this relates to 20th century warming and this increase here, especially the increase at the tail end. But that actually might not be the primary part of this story. Another part of this story is correlations with this record of delta O18 isotope derived temperatures with sea surface temperature. And we see very strong relationships here in the Indian Ocean and also here in the Eastern Pacific. A subsequent paper analyzed, excuse me, that was carbon-13. A subsequent paper analyzed delta O18 in Taiwan, which is farther to the east of Xi'an, and finds a very strong correlation with sea surface temperatures here. And that was actually published, but this is not a semi-arid site. The one in Xi'an is. So hopefully this has been a useful but a very small sampling of some of the application stories that are told by isotopes and tree rings. Over the last decade or two, with the proliferation of these isotope ratio mass spectrometers, as well as advances in terms of automation, size of samples that can be analyzed, et cetera, tree ring studies in which isotopes are analyzed are increasing in number, probably exponentially. They're being applied to a whole series of different fields, including ecology, climatology, hydrology, environmental science, global change, and more. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was really impressive. I'm afraid we have to move on, and we're getting closer and now into France with Lisa Wingate, who worked also with a group of Dan in Yatir and also in France, in Bordeaux. So Lisa, we're curious to hear what you say. Please go ahead. Can you unmute yourself, Lisa?
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, can you see the slides? Yes, okay. Thanks Tamia for introducing me. I'm going to talk about quite a long collaboration now we've had going with many people in the Zoom room who have worked in various ways in this forest that we see on the slides here. That's the Yatir forest that we've been hearing about in the Negev desert. And Dan was mentioning earlier that it's the biggest plantation in Israel. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about just about this forest and some of the nice results that have come out through the collaboration. Okay, so I'm just going to start with this because this is a snapshot into the future, apparently, that we obtained from global models and different simulations. And it's something that people in this conference are very aware of. It's that seasonal rainfall patterns around the Mediterranean area are likely to be significantly decreased. This is the percentage change of precipitation, which is indicated here to be between 10 and 20%, especially during the summer months. But we also know, because we're talking about Mediterranean systems here, that actually the summer, this is probably a very small change for environments where they get no rain in the June, July, August period. So what's more important is the December, January, February rainfall, which is really the winter rainfall that comes and actually supplies a lot of these this forest here. And what you see here is still, especially where the Yatir forest is located, that it still looks pretty bad even for the winter precipitation, that there will be reductions into the coming decades. And something that Naomi mentioned earlier was it's not just the number of rain days. Here, that trend is observed in data. This is for the East Mediterranean climate station, shown that the number of rain days over the years has been, there's a trend there of a decreasing number of rain days. But what's more important isn't so much also the amount, but it's the timing of when that rainfall arrives. And so here, this is rainfall from Yatir, that's measured in Yatir. And you can see this pattern where most of the rainfall, as we see here, is falling in the winter months. But what I draw your attention to is between one year and the next year, that rainfall can arrive either here, we see here in November, but in the following year here, I can hear myself. It comes a bit later in December.
You need to close the DDD application.
Where is that? Oh, sorry.
You need to close the DDD application. You have it open maybe in another browser or?
Oh, in the browser. I'm sorry, I don't know where this, I might need to stop sharing momentarily.
Or as Yakir notes, maybe someone else has it open. So please check. Or as Yakir notes, maybe someone else has it open. So please check. Can you try again, Lisa?
Okay, I'm gonna try.
Can you try again, Lisa?
No, it still seems to be strange, doing something strange.
There is one iPhone participant that is open, is not unmuted. So I'm going to mute
maybe
it.
it's that. Yeah, maybe you could just.
Yeah, I muted it. Let's go on.
Okay, so I go back.
Sorry for that.
I share my screen, go to the desktop, share. Okay, does everybody see again? And you can hear
Perfect.
me, and there's no echo now. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so we have this delay in the rains arriving. So previously, and this year, we see that they were arriving in November, and then in the year after, they were arriving in December. So one of the things that we're interested in is how critical this is for the plants, and how are they going to respond to these predictions of these changes in rainfall in the future. And one of the things that we're very interested in doing is developing models, or at least testing our models at sites to see whether we can actually find indicators that help us predict when trees might run into some difficulties, okay? And so as we've seen in this session and in other sessions during this conference, Yatir forest, it's the largest forest in Israel. It's 3,000 hectares of Aleppo pine, a common pine that's planted in Mediterranean regions. And it was planted in the late 1960s. And in the late 1960s as well, there was something else going on very important in Israel, not just the planting of the Yatir forest, but this little guy here in the corner, it's Dan, who was growing up, and he's doing some gardening here, planting some trees as well, fairly close by to the Yatir forest. And more or less, Dan's career has been, you know, on a nice trajectory. He's been growing along with these trees. So here he is, another picture of him beside another tree, a different type of tree, this time in California, when he went off, left Israel and studied and doing postdocs in the US. But then what's interesting is he came back in the early 90s and he set up a flux tower to measure the exchange of CO2, water and energy between these forests. And we've heard something about that even from his talk earlier this afternoon. And so our story, Jerome and I, our story really occurs in here, this field campaign where, again, we have another nice picture of Dan coding trees. These ones are in Yatir forest this time. And we also came over, we had a collaborative project, and we came over to Israel to do some field work, to work on looking at the data with the group in Weizmann, and also to do some training of the models that we use here in France. So what was happening over that period? So here we just show the rainfall. You can find more details about this because in Yakir's paper, Yakir Prisla, he published this data and it formed a big part of his thesis. What you can see here is we have quite dynamic rainfall patterns in this region, but you'll see that the amount is quite small. And you also notice that there's some years that the rainfall is very small indeed, 200 millimeters. And what we can see here from looking at the tree rings is that we actually get quite a good relationship. The basal area increment of these trees growing there is going up and down with the rainfall that's coming into this system, which is very pretty, in fact. But just after we had been, I don't think it was because we came to Israel and coded the trees, but shortly afterwards, there was some dieback found in the Yatir forest. And I don't know if you can see clearly on this, this picture, but there's a distribution of black dots which indicate areas on the landscape where there has been dieback occurring in the Yatir forest. And so one of the things that we were interested in looking at were the trees that died. And so Yakir, he came to Bordeaux and he measured, he took samples of the trees and we looked to see how the trend of the basal area changed over time. And so we can see here that there's definite patterns between trees that were surviving and trees that were dying over time. And you can see something seemed to go on back here in the early 1980s between these two sets of trees, but they still followed the general precipitation patterns over time. They were just kind of on a different, they were offset from one another, but they were still going up and down as the rainfalls came in. However, what we can see here is that definitely there was a decoupling with the trend in the rainfall here in Yatir forest in those trees that died from about 2005 onwards. So we wanted to understand a bit better what was actually going on here during this period and also during these other periods where there has been really strong drought. And for that, one of the tools that we used was a model. It's a model that Jerome Auger created during his PhD many years ago, 2003. And this model, it's quite useful to apply in Yatir because it's really designed to simulate the fluxes of evaporation and CO2 that's measured by the flux tower. But it also gives a fairly detailed representation of what's going on with the soil moisture. And that was one of the big things that we wanted to really understand better at this forest because we knew that this would be crucial. And so here on this plot, what you can see is what we have here are all the years from 1997 to 2010. And what you can see here are red dots. And those are the data that come from the flux tower. And you've got a nice picture here of the flux tower. And what we're actually showing here are the fluxes per day of evapotranspiration on the top of panel, gross primary production in the middle. And another unique feature of this model that we use is that the model can also predict what we think the xylem water potential of the plant is, how it's varying over time. And so what you can see here is over time that it's very dynamic over the growing season, the fluxes and the water potential. And what you can also see is from year to year, it's less apparent in the fluxes, but it's more apparent in the xylem water potential, that you have years where you have a very strong drought stress, whereas other years you have less drought stress. And so we wanted to look at this a bit more detail and find out what indicators we could use to predict whether the tree was really in trouble. And so one of the things that we benefited from was that Yakir and other folk in the team, they actually went out to the field site and they measured the plant water potential. And they measured it at 2 times during the day over the growing season. They measured it pre-dawn in the very early morning. And they also measured it during the day, midday. And what we actually obtained from this, when you plot a line through this, the closer, so that the larger the difference between the pre-dawn and the midday leaf water potential, this is indicating that the plant is probably well supplied by water. Whereas the closer those two values become, this is implying that the difference between what's in the soil and what's in the plant is very small. And this is indicating generally that the stomata are closing on the plant leaves. And so what we do when we put a line through here, more or less, we get this critical value that tells us the water potential of the plant when the stomata close. And so this could be quite useful information for us in our model, because we might want to know how long those trees are sitting with their stomata closed, because that's giving us an indication of how stressed they are. And so what we have here is a plot now. It's like a fingerprint of what's going on with the water potential, the plant water potential in Yatir forest each year, and over the season and over the day. And so basically when you see a lot of blue in those years, this is telling you that the water potential values are quite, that they're closer to 0 rather than those very negative values. And you can see clearly that there's some years where you have very red regions in 1998, 99, and 2010, 2011. So we have very low plant water potential. And here in the white, this white bar, which you see in these years, those are the periods when the plants are hitting that critical water potential value where their stomata close, okay? So we see that occurs in 1998, 99, and in 2010, 2011. And we also see we've got this plot of the basal area index showing that in 2010, we did coincide here where we had very low basal area increment with a year where we had the trees sitting at this critical water potential value.
2 minutes, Lisa.
I'm almost done. So what we looked at was then this the distribution of the water in those 2 periods, because in fact what you can see in that first period where we've got those 2 red zones, we actually had less water, but it wasn't enough to, it didn't seem to be enough to kill the trees at that moment. Whereas in 2009, 2010, that period, we actually had more water. But what you can see here is that the arrival of the water in 2010 was very late. It came in December. And so what we deduced from this was that really, when we looked at the length of the dry period over this tree ring record, we could see that actually in 2010, we were actually dealing with a year with the highest length of dry period in days during the dry season. And actually, it's quite dramatic. And if we think back to that plot showing the number of the reduction in rainy days that I showed at the beginning, this is more or less consistent with that you've got this reduction in days with rain, and here we're seeing we've got an increase in the length of dry period days. So it's quite coherent what's going on here. So I'm just wanting to finish now. It's just a very simple message that it's just echoing what Naomi said earlier, that it's not necessarily the amount of rainfall. They don't get a lot of rain, these trees, but actually they can go with quite a little amount of rain, just depending on how it's provided to them. And so I just want to say thank you once again to invite me to give the talk and to basically show some of the nice results that came out from this collaboration in Yatir Forest. And also just to thank Dan for all his support over the years. And he's really, I mean, the session is called Torch in the Light, but he's really always been ahead of the wave, and he's really been inspirational to both myself and Jerome. He's always, you know, every time you think, oh, maybe this is a good idea, you best look at Dan's literature, because he's probably already done it at some point. So we'd like to thank Dan. And this photograph was taken in a nicer time when there was no social distancing, and I'm really looking forward to seeing Dan again in the coming years, so that we can have a nice drink and discuss life and things. So thank you for listening, and sorry for the complications with the sharing the screen and things like that earlier.
Thank you, Lisa, for this wonderful talk. I welcome questions either on the photos of Dan or on tree rings. Both are valid.
I have to find out where these pictures came from.
Aha, I have my secret sources.
Like Jerome gave me a hint.
Yeah, I should have asked in the community for more photos. I'm sure there's other photos out there. I almost wrote to Jali Gashgai, because I'm sure she has some great photos of you in some CB meetings.
So now we can let Dan have the opportunity to make some comments and maybe some thoughts about everything we saw today.
Okay, so maybe I will share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we only have a few minutes left before the end of the session. So first, thank you, Tamir, for organizing this. It was a great surprise when you first told me about the session and this big title and all these guests from all over the world. I think that was really exciting and rewarding for me. Indeed, 20 years in Yatir is a big chunk of time, and we shared a good part of it together. So thank you very much. It was also good to see all the friends. I really want to thank Alex and Lisa and Naomi and Steve. All good friends, as Lisa said, from better times when we can really get together, both here and in their respective countries. Also, thank you for all the audiences. I think we were about 20 in the session, but the organizers say that more than 30 were watching this from outside. So I think that was really good. So just to close with a few comments, this is actually, this slide is the starting point for Yatir. I was 20 years ago, I was really impressed and amazed by this global effort of ecosystem research that was called the FluxNet. But looking at the map, it was obvious that we can really contribute something that is significant, because our climatic region was clearly not well represented in this effort. So we jumped on the opportunity and we were really highly motivated, but that motivation is not enough and there was no money. Usually we brag about the big grant that we obtain and how much money we gain. But I think in Yatir, I like to highlight the pioneering spirit that we had. And indeed, we started Yatir going into the junkyard near Tel Aviv. And we found these junk pieces of a crane. And we took them to a friend's shop near the Dead Sea, which you see on the left here. And he helped us, this guy here, who is not alive anymore, he helped us to fix this junk, painted it white and against corrosion, and then white and then green. And then we went to the center of the Yatir forest and we dug a big hole, put the crane inside it, pour 11 tons of concrete, and lo and behold, we have now a state-of-the-art research station. Note that when we started in 2000, the concentration in the atmosphere was 372 ppm, and now we are 413, and that's one of the reasons we are doing this research. Everything is changing and we need to understand what is happening. So early on, it was good to see that we got some recognition, and this is the old cover from Global Change Biology, our prime journal. And this is, of course, our tower today, including the camera that Lisa had us installed from the Phenocam. I think it's not working anymore, but hopefully you got some data from that. Pretty early on, Eyal Rothenberg joined us, which was very important. He became a central figure in this 20 years of research. And a few years later, more or less halfway through, we felt already limited by this piece of metal stuck in the ground with 11 tons of concrete. We couldn't move it, and it will never move from there. And realizing that we cannot build 10 towers across Israel, we went to a new idea and build this mobile lab, which again was built from scratch here in Israel with the help of course, with professionals. But that, again, was not something that was bought off the shelf. And in it, we put a lot of equipment, including the PTRMS that Alex has used when he was here. That's inside the truck. I don't think the PTRMS actually is shown here. This is the Ozen instrument. But believe me, it was there, and Alex was here too for that. And he told us a little bit about it. We also had to train the students to drive the truck, including the girls. And almost every student that joined the group has to do a truck driving license. So that's our group. Around the tower, we now have hundreds of sensors of measurements, and every year it's just getting more exciting. Measurements from below ground, at the surface, in the tree rings, the chambers, the tower, in the boundary layer above it, with LiDAR and ceilometers, from remote sensing and modeling. And we try to stay at the state of the art with all sort of instrumentation. Now we're measuring SIF, the sun-induced fluorescence, the carbonyl sulfide, stable isotopes, as Steve has mentioned, and drone is becoming very popular these days. Over these 20 years, out of all the students in the group, I counted 31 graduate students and postdocs focused on Yatir. And this has been really reassuring, rewarding, and a lot of satisfaction to see all these people, very excellent students, hardworking and bright, and all the work that came out from these theses. Of course, they have a face. It's not just list of name, and I probably didn't find the pictures of everyone. So this is just a sample of these students. And you can see at the top the high spirit that we see. I think last year we counted in the group that we really try to keep it international and cosmopolitan. I think we counted 5 religions. And believe me, there are other religions than Jewish and Christian, and 6 nationalities in the group. So this was really a hallmark of our activities, and we try to maintain it and keep it going this way. I think you saw already in some of the picture that other people showing, including the last slide from Lisa, that picnic is the big issue in Yatir. And this is just a small collection of the wonderful picnics we have with various people. This is including with collaborators with Germany, from Austria, and from England. And you can see that the food is just keeping being improved. So, serious science, but, we have to have good food for that. So this was just a quick give you a taste of our station, and we are ready to start the next 20-year cycles, and there are more PhD and postdoc opportunity available. Please come and join us. So Tamir, with this, I return the stage to you, and again, thank you all for this special treat today.
Thank you, Dan. This was very inspiring.
Thanks, Dan.
Very exciting to see all of you today. And as you mentioned, there are so many others that we haven't seen, but they remain with us with the Yatir project and now the truck. I just have my first student with a truck driving license. A second one is joining, so yeah, we keep it running. And with that, I want to invite you to continue with the conference. There's a concluding session, I think, at 7:30. And that's all for us. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Ciao.
Tamir. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Ooh.